Hi there, folks. So the subject I'm going to talk about this evening is quite a serious one, and it's about paedophilia. It's a really serious and emotional issue, and I suppose what prompted me to want to talk about it, my own foster brother that I grew up with was convicted a while back and has recently been facing more serious allegations alleging child abuse, really sexual abuse of teenagers. And I suppose it's sort of made me think about it more recently. And then this evening, I was watching television, and there's a show called Gogglebox where they review different films. And one of the films that they happened to review was called The Orphan. I think it's a Netflix film. It's a horror film on Netflix, I think. And it basically has a young girl who's dressed very seductively and is attempting to seduce her foster father. But as there's a twist in this horror story that she's meant to be a woman who is trapped in the body of a child, sort of, although really it doesn't portray that genetic condition properly. Somebody that's got that kind of dwarfism doesn't look anything like that. And really it flirts with paedophilia, really, and I think it's quite a sort of disturbing kind of film from the sort of brief accounts that I've read of it. It sort of has various scenes where there are this young girl who's dressed very seductively and even plants a kiss on her foster father's face. And there are lots of other films, of course, of a similar kind of nature. And today on the internet, there's a whole industry of different child pornography, sadly. It's just boggling to think how much there might be out there. It's just, profoundly disturbing, really. And I think in recent years, we've seen a kind of movement to try and normalize it amongst some people. I don't think it's a mainstream thing. For example, there was a talk on TED Talks. It's a very big talk platform. And there was one particular speaker that they entertained, and she was really trying to say that we should have more compassion and sympathy for paedophiles and to understand their position and to see it as a mental disorder, that they're suffering and that they are isolated and they are judged by society. Well, now that provokes an interesting discussion, doesn't it? Whether it is a mental disorder or not. There's a very big discussion within that, if it is a mental disorder, and indeed how it should be treated, as a pathology. There's certainly a possibility that it could well be some sort of mental disorder. Evidence that I looked at from psychological journals suggests that people that have been sexually abused at a younger age are more likely, disproportionately more likely to be child abusers, to sexually assault children themselves. However, a vast majority of those that are victims of such sexual assaults or molestations never go on to commit any sort of abuse like that. So it doesn't excuse any of that kind of behaviour. But I think there are, for some people that are exposed to that kind of abuse at an early age and that perhaps lack sufficient support, they're more likely perhaps to make bad choices. However, it doesn't excuse it, because there's a lot of people that have had very similar experiences that never do anything like that. And so there's no real justification for that. But it does make me wonder why adults have got these sick kind of thoughts, these really disturbing thoughts about children. First of all, there's a distinction between something called pedastry and paedophilia. They're often lumped in as one, and they are quite similar and overlap, to be sure. But there is also an important distinction to be made, and that pedastry is where an adult is attracted towards and seeks after teenagers, adolescents, really, very young adults, or older children, however you define it, people that are post-pubescent, generally you would expect them to be 12, 13, going upwards, 14, 15, 16, 17, that kind of age. Whereas pedophiles target younger children, pre-pubescent children, from 0, sadly, all the way up to 12, 13. And then there's that sort of in-between area where they overlap. So obviously pedastry itself is a particularly bad thing anyway, where adults are preying on youngsters, minors, who are still physically more immature, psychologically and emotionally more immature. The brain is underdeveloped. The human brain is always developing up until the age of about 24, where it's fully developed at that point. So you're more able at that age to reason, to rationalize, to discern and make different decisions. We generally make more sensible decisions and are capable intellectually and emotionally as well, because we've had more of a variety of different life experiences. So a teenager, therefore, is much more naive and, depending on their life experiences, they may be, much more easier to manipulate and to control than someone who's a lot older and is a bit more wise to the ways of the world, because they have naturally more experiences of it. And also, where their brain is more developed, they also have a better cognitive ability as well. So I think there is that clear distinction between pedastry and paedophilia, but they do obviously overlap as well. But it is important to sort of distinguish between them. Paedophilia is, in particular, a lot more harmful, much worse than pedastry. Not to sort of make pedastry sound any like a good thing in comparison, but paedophilia is much worse because, of course, a child is that much younger, is much more emotionally and psychologically immature, and especially a prepubescent child is not physically capable of any kind of physical act in that sense. They're underdeveloped, but also emotionally and psychologically too. They're unaware of what's appropriate behaviour. They don't understand morally, ethically, what's right and wrong. They're too young at that point to make a moral discernment. So they're much more easier to take advantage of. Of course, it's important to educate young people about the risks and dangers of older predatory adults that would want to take advantage of them. And why do these adults have those unnatural, sick desires? Well, it's a real question I've struggled with over the years. Because I think an early exposure to sexual abuse alone can't account for that. Just because we know that there is lots of people that went through similar kinds of abuse and never go on to commit any kind of act. In fact, because they themselves, having been victims, know the actual trauma that such a thing can give someone and the lifelong struggle that it can lead to, And there could be several reasons why someone could be drawn towards those things, aside from having some sort of early experience of that. It could be that, and I think it's for minority people, but there could well be some people that were brought up within a kind of a weird cult, where that kind of behaviour is normalised for them. And that's probably a small minority, I would imagine. But nevertheless, for them, I suppose, it's much more harder, especially if they remain within their adult lives and remain connected to other people. It could be family members too, people that reinforce those ideas and try to normalise it for them. It could be much more harder for them to break away from a cult-like mentality, especially if they have physical, emotional, and indeed also financial connections to those people potentially. That could prove a difficulty for them. But then, as you get older and you're more aware of other people's lives, you have a variety of different experiences, you're much more capable of discerning and making a judgment over what is right and wrong in a situation. And so there's, much better chance of someone breaking away once they're out of an age where they can understand, and that they have an ability, to have at least some independence of thought and to make their own decision, because, adults much less dependent upon their parents and their wider family. So, and I think that's probably a minority of people, but I think a much larger group, I would think, is an exposure to various types of sexual pornography that's becoming more prevalent over the decades. But of course, I'm not going to say that it's something new or that arrived in the 1960s with the sexual revolution or anything. There may have been a renaissance and a resurgence of it in some ways, but it is nothing new, and nothing new under the sun. It goes back to the ancient world, and sadly, you'll find terrible books, with very graphic images, of terrible depravity that existed many thousands of years ago, and even hundreds of years ago. You'll see such similar kinds of immoral pornography. But today, in the internet, it's much more easily accessible for many people. But it's not something that you naturally see unless you're going out of your way to look for it. Or is it? Well, it may be that there are some things that people are exposed to within our culture anyway. Even if there's only a small minority of people that are paedophiles, they still have an agenda. When people engage within something themselves, they want to normalise that to other people. We all do. If I drink a lot, I want to put out there a message that drinking's okay within moderation, because that's what I might maybe believe, So things that we indulge in, habits that we do, behaviours that we do ourselves, we want to create medias, books, journals, blogs, posts, tweets, films, artwork, of course, sculptures. We want to create things that will celebrate the behaviours that we do and the things that we believe in, to try and encourage other people to do it too. If I believe something's right because I'm doing it, I naturally want to create other art forms, other medias, and I want to encourage other people and advertise it to them as to why I believe in that. And that's what we all do naturally, isn't it, anyway? But what's disturbing and difficult is when somebody does something to encourage others when it's actually something that's deeply harmful, and something that has profoundly dangerous effects and implications emotionally, psychologically, mentally and physically too, during the course of the child's development. Throughout his adult life, it can still continue to have an effect upon their lives. And so we would expect, even though there are only a minority of people, sadly, that engage in this kind of immoral sexual act, and all the grooming and behaviour associated around the sexual acts as well, that minority still will be creating various art forms, whether they're paintings, sculptures, films, books, journals, posts, tweets, and they could be in various forms. They could be overt, it could be obvious in your face, or it could be covert, it could be quite insidious, it could be very understated and subtle even. There could be various different ways of implying things, Look at Betty Boo, for example. Some people say that's quite normal and it's very mainstream and it's just a laugh. But is it? This is a character, and it's only a cartoon character, but it's a cartoon character that portrays what is a young girl with a very high-pitched voice, but who's really dressing like an older woman in a highly sexualized manner with that sort of seductive makeup and dresses. And so you really feel that kind of character, for example, is really portraying a child, but adulterized, dressed in an adult kind of form. And so there are no doubt lots of different images that we are all going to sort of come into contact with at various points in our lives. That doesn't mean that we have to celebrate them, or we have to sort of enjoy them or we have to agree with them in any way. You know, I might see things that celebrate violence in some ways. I've got nothing against seeing a portrayal of violence. I think it's necessary if it's done in a sensitive and accurate and realistic manner. I think it's necessary to actually demonstrate what the real effects of violence, physically and psychologically, what that impact has on people. You know, but there are also other films, of course, that may sometimes glamorize or celebrate gratuitous kinds of violence without really showing the actual psychological, emotional and physical effects of it. And I'm quite likely to come into contact with a variety of things like that, just from meeting people that maybe have grown up in that environment and that may be their belief at a young age, or other films that portray that, you know, and I don't have to agree or celebrate or live my life in accordance with that just because I viewed something. So just because we view something doesn't mean that we have to copy it or imitate it in any way. But we are going to come into contact with some things like that sometimes that can provoke thoughts within us. You know, I might have very angry thoughts sometimes. I might have very violent thoughts sometimes. I do actually. But I've got a responsibility to rein those in and control them and to be responsible for my behaviour. I've not always been. And sometimes I've verbally assaulted people, shamefully, you know, members of the public who didn't deserve it. And I just allowed myself to sort of shout junk at people and, you know, and didn't sort of control my temper sometimes. And that's a fault that I recognise myself. I didn't go out and sort of assault them and GBH them, however. There was still a level of restraint, at least. But we have to be responsible for what we do with our thoughts, you know, and what we allow our thoughts to be and how we engage those thoughts with the world, what media we choose to watch, and not just how we're watching it, but actually then what we do with that, you know, what we think about that. We're not passive observers, passengers of life. We also have to drive our own bodies and our own minds and have some active capacity. We have to actively read things and discern and come to our own judgment and discover, you know, what do we think about things. We have to sort of debate with ourselves and with other people where we have an opportunity to as well. And it's really important, especially for adults and parents, to discuss with their children and teenagers as well, you know, the moral dimension of different medias that they're engaging in. It's a really good opportunity to sit and watch things with them, you know, whether it's computer games or different films, books that they're reading, journals, posts that they read online, you know, whatever the media happens to be. It's really important to be engaging with your children and with your friends as well, to find out, you know, what they think about it. And it also allows you to challenge yourself too within that discussion, you know. So to go back to the question I'm sort of asking, you know, why do people have those unnatural thoughts? I think probably there is a certain degree for many of them where they've been exposed to some sort of media that have allowed that to be celebrated or normalised to some extent. They've come into contact with something that's provoked them, seduced them in some way. But I think in some ways, if you see an image, and I one day had the misfortune to see an awful image. I didn't choose it. It was posted online on some blog. And in fact, it was a discussion about Michael Jackson, funnily enough, about whether or not he was a paedophile or not. And that was the nature of the blog, really. People were arguing about whether he was or not. And then somebody posted an image on there from a book that allegedly he'd had in his apartment in Netherlands. And the book, I think, was called The Boy or something. And it was meant to be a legal book. Legal because it was not children engaging in any explicit sexual act with adults. they were simply pictures of children that were naked, I suppose. But I felt that it should have been made illegal, and it was wrong. Just because, although they weren't engaging in any sexual acts, they were posing in a deliberately provocative manner, one which was really quite disturbing and very concerning, and just kind of just made you feel kind of like, ugh, just something just wrong. And I felt at the time when I looked at the image, it was a sort of like a young boy who was sort of like thrusting his bum out in a sort of very provocative manner, and it seemed to me not something a child would have naturally done. It seemed to be something that had been choreographed, and that he'd probably been coaxed into doing it by some adult, and it's quite disturbing, really. But just viewing an image like that puts a really like kind of disgusting image in your brain, but it actually makes you have sort of a seductive thought about a child, quite wrongfully, because of the seductive pose that they're posing in. You know, it's sort of like, and it's the real fault is that the person that took the picture choreographed it. You know, there's no fault in the child, for they probably had no idea what they were participating in at that age. Of course not. Whether or not that person should have posted that online in that manner for people to view, I don't know. I think the manner that they posted it in was one where we were discussing the type of material found in his home, and they wanted to show to other discussers what that type of material was, because other people were arguing it wasn't pornography, it was just an art form, you know, celebrating the beauty of the human body. And they wanted to demonstrate, no, it wasn't. It's actually something that's deliberately in a seductive, over-sexualizing way. So the posting of that picture was to sort of prove that point, I suppose. And I just felt like when I'd seen it, it put a vulgar image in my head, and it gave me a horrible thought. But I didn't act on it or do anything about it, and it's never made me want to go out and look for any material like that at all. And I just found it just quite disturbing in that. And I don't know whether if somebody saw enough images like that, whether that would provoke them. But I don't think that anyone is forced or coerced to go out and look for those kind of things. I think you always have a choice, even if you see or witness something like that, then whether you act on that or not, you know, that still comes down to your choice. And, you know, you can think of rare examples where someone might be forced or coerced into watching something like that. But then you are still responsible where you are capable and able to make decisions about what you decide to do, what you then do with whatever images you've seen, you know, whether you decide to look at that as a disgusting image and you're going to consider it as that, or whether you then allow yourself to become, you know, eroticized by it, or and I don't know why people do that. I don't really understand. Thinking about the situation with my foster brother, I was speculating earlier when writing a letter to him that I felt probably one of the reasons that he targeted children to have relationships with them was a psychological one rather than just physical. I felt like because somebody is physically, not physically, but emotionally and psychologically immature, that he would be able to have power and control over them in a way that he wouldn't be with someone that was his intellectual and emotional equivalent, that someone his own age would have that same level, the same capacity to argue with him, to hold him to account, to question him, could stand their ground to him, in other words. They would be of a competent, similar level to him. That they wouldn't be able to be as influenced or under control from him. You know, like someone who is young and much more immature, it's much more easier, isn't it? I know when I was that age, you know, I did all sorts of crazy things. I still do, but not to the extent I did then. You know, I was so much more trusting then. It's the things that I did. And, you know, for example, with him, I did some things like naked wrestling, and I thought it was all just innocent. And even though I was about 13 and he was 19, and I thought it was just mucking about and having fun. I didn't consider that it could be that an adult that much older could be doing it for any other reason than just having a laugh. And didn't really enter my thoughts at the time. I just thought, you know, just having fun. But because when you're older, you look back with hindsight and you sort of feel like you look differently at things. You know, I didn't really know at that time. I think there's a lot of teenagers just as perhaps vulnerable who aren't really aware of what designs other older adults have on them. But I think that's probably one motivation, that some older adults, they like that control that they can have. You know, they've got that financial control over a youngster who doesn't have that ability to earn money. You know, they're not a breadwinner, they're young, they're likely to be poorer, you know, financially poorer, but emotionally too, you know, much more easier to manipulate and control and to buy and to use in that way. And it really, to turn the question around another way, to ask why some adults target youngsters to have relationships, really to ask that in a different way would be to say, why don't those adults want to engage in relationships with other adults their own age? I think that's kind of more on the question. You know, why don't these grown men find other women attractive? There's plenty of them, you know. It seems odd to me. There's lots of pornography online, if you want to view it, that's consensual, that's legal. Whether it's moral or not, you know, that's down to you to discern in your heart what you feel is right, isn't it? But you know, there are lots of people that you could have a relationship with of your own age, you know, but that would mean you don't get to have that level of control over them, because it's more of a relationship that's on the level with equals, rather than a dominating relationship of one that has so much control and power and the other that has so much less. And so I think there's the psychological component within that. When I think about it, it just kind of, it's just utterly selfish that somebody will put their own sexual gratification and desire above the welfare of somebody else, of someone who's so much younger, and, you know, and not even care or be concerned about the awful pain and the harm that they do to that person. What they'll do in their propaganda, that, you know, how they twist things, is that they describe it as helping and caring about the youngster, you know, befriending them, and of course, you know, there are good ways of caring about youngsters, like in a platonic love, one that cares about them in a way a good parent cares about a child, in the way a guardian or a mentor cares about a youngster, or an older brother or sister, for example, you know, in a platonic way where you really do care about the nurturing and the emotional and physical well-being of that child and their development. But to use them for your own gratification, for your own selfish desire, to achieve that physical satisfaction and that psychological dominance and need for control over others, you know, it's a very deprived thing, actually. And that whole sort of twisted ideology, trying to convince people that it's, you know, the type of language they use is that it's a liberation for the child. It's like that's the sort of Orwellian sort of double-speak language that they use, really. It's, you know, it's sort of like being liberated from a safe, secure and protective environment. You know, you might as well say a terrorist liberates us from living our lives or something, you know, or an abuser liberates us from living an emotionally nurtured life. You know, it's really kind of warped, the type of language that they use to try and justify their own actions. Now, do I have sympathy and compassion for people that do have awful ideas like this, but that make every effort to prevent themselves from doing those things? Yes, I suppose so. And there may well be people that have distorted and perverted ideas, perhaps through exposure to or witnessing it, or through some type of media that they've experienced in some way. But it's still their responsibility and their duty to control their actions and to prevent themselves. You know, there's been this online thing the last few years about this whole notion of a virtuous paedophile, in fact. But to me, that whole term muddies the water of what is defined as being a paedophile. We traditionally always refer to a paedophile as one who acts on these ill intentions, you know, one who actually sexually grooms or molests or rapes a child, one who sexually abuses a child to some capacity, right? That's what a paedophile is in the traditional definition of the term. So this virtuous paedophile definition is trying to sort of like change the definition of it to define it as one who has the thoughts about doing that, rather than one who acts on those thoughts. You know, if you have those kind of thoughts but don't do anything like that, are you really a paedophile in that? You know, if you don't actually do anything about it, if you never do, then, you know, it's so equating the two things seems to be strange to me. It seems to be muddying the water and trying to deliberately confuse issues. You know, somebody that has violent thoughts but has never gone out and committed any assault, would you describe that as a violent person? I wouldn't. I'd say that that's someone that was perfectly restrained, whatever disgusting or terrible thoughts they'd had, that had never acted on it, and that they weren't a violent person, therefore. You know, I wouldn't muddy the issue by saying they're a violent person because they'd somehow had thoughts about it. If they'd gone out of their way to watch gratuitously violent things and celebrated those things and distributed those kind of things and promoted and produced those things, that could be a different thing altogether, right? But if they didn't, then they wouldn't be someone who's naturally a violent person by nature. You know, if they had controlled their actions, they didn't act on it, you know, they didn't distribute violent images, they didn't celebrate it or produce violent artwork themselves, you know, things that celebrate violence, I mean, rather than try to depict its reality and its awful consequences that can happen. So I would say, yeah, they're my general reflections. And I would really encourage other people to sort of study really interesting and taboo subjects like that, and just to sort of look at, investigate what your own thoughts are on different subjects, and also to discuss those with people around you, because like it or hate it, you know, it's an issue that affects many people. It's not going away, and it's something that we all in different ways have to deal with in life, isn't it? And